Hello and welcome to Unacademy IAS English, a one-stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. Welcome to episode number 4 of Chanakya Niti. In today's session, we are going to discuss Kautilya's Danda Neeti and coercive state power, which is essential for any state to protect its national interests. This discussion is part of a limited series that we have launched. Under Chanakya Niti, we are trying to understand Kautilyan thought, especially with focus on geopolitics, statecraft, warfare and espionage. And we are trying to apply Kautilyan thought and ancient Indian political thought into contemporary geopolitics. So this discussion would be immensely helpful for civil services aspirants while answering questions in GS paper 2 and paper 3 under international relations and as well as under internal security. These discussions will also help students with PSIR as their optional subject, political science and international relations as their optional. You can even use these discussions in your essay papers as well in related topics. So these sessions are uploaded every Wednesday at 8 p.m. So if you are liking our initiative and if you feel it's a unique initiative which can help the aspirants, do let me know in the comments. If you want us to continue with more episodes under Chanakya Niti, do let me know in the comments. And don't forget to press the like button and do subscribe to our channel for more such interesting content. So let's begin the discussion with a simple practice question. Because today we will be discussing about philosophies such as Dharmashastra and Dandashastra, and we'll try to apply that into contemporary geopolitics. So let's take a basic question on this. Dharmashastra and Dandashastra find a reference in ancient Indian political thought in which of the following scriptures? Is it found in Mahabharata or Manusmriti or Kautilya's Arthashastra, or do they find a mention in all the above? Let me know the answer in the comment section. So before we start the discussion, I have a very important announcement for 2026 aspirants. Those who are preparing for 2026, if you are looking for comprehensive guidance and coaching, Unacademy IAS English has recently started Liberty Batch. So this is a comprehensive program covering live and recorded classes by our top educators, along with access to prelims and mains test series with mentorship and doubt resolution sessions. So you can enroll for the program at a price of just $24,999, and we have a special offer going on where you're not only getting a discount, this would be the discounted price. Along with that, you're getting a 9-month extension on your subscription as well. So if you want some counseling in this regard to decide whether you want to enroll for the program or not, then you can sign up for a free counseling session by filling the Google form which is provided in the description box below. Just share your details in the Google form. The link is provided below and we will get in touch with you so that you can clear all your doubts before you enroll for the program. So with this, let's get started and let's discuss Kautilya's Danda Neeti. See, in ancient Indian political and strategic thought, if you look at Hindu scriptures and as well as few Buddhist and Jain scriptures, there is a reference to two important philosophies and doctrines, Dharmashastra and Dandashastra. Now, what do you mean by Dharmashastra and Dandashastra? Dharmashastra refers to a set of principles. You can equate this with ethics, morals, and it essentially serves as a guide to a king who's looking after the governance of a state or a kingdom. A king is expected to be fair and neutral. A king is expected to be righteous, protect the weak against the evil and the corrupt. In this regard, Dharmashastra provides guidance to the king. It lays out the ethical, moral constraints and obligations, establishes the principles of fair governance, and you can apply this for any aspect of administration. You can apply this for economic management, you can apply this for socio-economic welfare, and you can definitely apply this for geopolitics, warfare, and espionage as well. In every aspect of administration and governance, Dharmashastra will apply. Now, to enforce these principles and guidelines, The instrument which is available to the king or the state is Dandashastra. The term Danda essentially refers to punishment or coercion, or it could even mean enforcement. Depending on the context, depending on its application, and depending on what purpose it is trying to serve, Danda can be equated with many different terminologies. So if Dharmashastra provides the rules, the laws and guidelines, Dandashastra is about enforcing those laws and rules, especially to enforce discipline in the economy, in the society and in the world order. Because in any society there would be poor and weaker sections who might be exploited by the powerful, by the rich and the corrupt. So it's a king's duty, a righteous duty of the king, to ensure there is fairness in the society and the weak are protected against the evil. This is where Dandashastra comes in, where the king can punish, tame or coerce or even subdue, conquer or restrain by enforcing the rules, by enforcing the laws. And that is what you mean by Dandashastra or Danda Neeti. And Kautilya talks about this extensively in the Arthashastra. In fact, Danda is one of the key elements of state power. It is one of the routes through which the state can exercise its reach and influence and maintain discipline and order, not just within the country, but even outside the country. For example, in geopolitical terms, if a state has to protect its territorial integrity and sovereignty, the king has to enforce or punish or coerce the external and internal enemies of the state. This is where Dandashastra comes into picture. So Kautilya talks about maintaining that delicate balance between Dharma and Danda. There is an interlinkage that exists between Dharmashastra and Dandashastra, and Kautilya talks about this in the Arthashastra. He says that a king definitely should pay attention to the ethical, moral principles, the rules and laws to ensure fairness in the society and just governance and ensure there is justice which is done in the world order. To achieve that, Danda becomes the tool, the instrument available to the king or the state to protect the Dharma. This is the interlinkage that exists, and Kautilya talks about maintaining that balance between Dharma and Danda. Now in today's class, let's dive a little deep into this topic and apply Dharma and Dandashastra in geopolitics, and I will give you sufficient examples from contemporary geopolitics where we can apply Kautilyan thought to understand these recent developments as well. I'm not saying that Kautilyan philosophy has entirely inspired contemporary geopolitics. I'm definitely not saying that. What I'm saying is that you can better understand today's foreign policy of India, today's security challenges of India and the world by looking at it through the prism of Kautilyan thought. So Kautilyan thought on Danda Neeti, on Dharmashastra can serve as a guide, as a reference to interpret and analyze today's geopolitics. So that is where Kautilyan philosophy becomes very, very relevant for our exams. So I'm sure most of you agree with this assessment. Now let me give you an example from contemporary world regarding Dharmashastra and Dandashastra. Now if you look at the global world order, if you look at global conflicts, if you look at wars happening around the world, there are a set of restrictions and constraints which we refer to as the international humanitarian law. We have the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, we have the Geneva Conventions, the Genocide Convention, etc. They constitute part of the international customary law on human rights. They define certain restrictions as far as wars and conflicts are concerned. They limit the powers of the state which are involved in conflict to protect and uphold human rights, to protect the weak, to protect the civilians, to protect the non-combatants, and even to protect prisoners of war and as well as combatants who are injured in a conflict. States are prohibited under international humanitarian law from targeting innocent civilians, non-combatants and combatants who are injured, or even POWs. Any violation of these laws constitutes war crimes, crimes against humanity, and can even be labeled as an act of genocide if there is an attempt to wipe out an entire community with force. So this represents the dharma in current international order. If you want an example or an equivalent to understand Dharmashastra, international humanitarian law that expects countries to be righteous, that expects the states to protect the weak, to protect justice, to be fair. It places these restrictions on the states when they are involved in a war or a conflict. Any breach or any violations of the dharma of the international humanitarian law can be punished through organizations such as United Nations and by the global community through sanctions, which is nothing but a type of danda. Punishment, coercion, and force can be used to bring the states which are in violation of international humanitarian law into the right line. So countries can target those states which are committing war crimes with economic sanctions and isolate them economically. So this is one type of enforcement or punishment. You can call it a carrot and stick policy, where you use the stick or the danda to punish the violators, to punish those who are evil and corrupt and protect the weaker sections. Diplomatic sanctions can be imposed to isolate and corner a country which is breaking international humanitarian law. A country can be diplomatically isolated and cut off. And eventually, UN Security Council can even authorize the use of force, to use military force to subdue a country, to punish a country which is committing gross atrocities and violations. So this would be a right example to understand dharma and danda. If international humanitarian law represents the dharma, then the sanctions regime imposed through UN and the global community, which includes economic, diplomatic and military sanctions, it represents the danda. Now Kautilya talks extensively about war, the strategies, the tactics of warfare, how danda can be a tool for punishment, enforcement to protect national interests. So this is the focus of my today's discussion. How a country like India can protect its national interests, how a country like India can ward off external and internal enemies by leveraging danda, by employing Danda Neeti propagated by Kautilya, which is a key element of state power. How we can exercise danda, how we can punish the enemies, coerce the enemies, threaten the enemies to protect the interests of a state. This is what we will look at today. So from a geopolitical prism, from a national security prism, let's try to apply Kautilyan thought and let's take up some examples from the Indian context and also from contemporary geopolitics. See, Kautilya was a pragmatic. I think I've mentioned this in previous 3 episodes as well. By the way, if you haven't watched the other 3 episodes, please do go back and watch the other 3 episodes as well, because we have covered some very interesting discussions on Kautilyan thought. So Kautilya, who was a realist, he always advocated against war. Kautilya always focused on welfare, focused on peace and stability, because as a far-sighted thinker, he understood the importance of avoiding war. This is exactly what I discussed in the previous 2 episodes as well. Kautilya's first advice when it comes to vigraha or warfare was to avoid the war if it is possible, to avoid the clashes or conflicts. Now this was a great piece of advice for the king, which is relevant in today's times. If diplomacy works, if covert strategies work, you can avoid a full-fledged war, because according to Kautilya, wars are expensive. It is cost prohibitive. The country's economy will be destroyed and the human cost would be very, very high. In a full-fledged war, you might lose soldiers, you might lose civilians, your resources will get destroyed. It might strengthen your internal enemies when you're busy fighting an external war, thus weakening the state. So Kautilya was an advocate of welfare state. As a pragmatic, realistic, far-sighted thinker, he always advised the king to avoid war at any cost. Use any option available. Use diplomacy. use the strategies of upayas, the 4 upayas we have studied under episode 2, or employ the 6 sadgunyas. Use these strategies to avoid a full-fledged war so that the enemies and threats can be dealt with without going to a full-fledged conflict. But Kautilya, being a realistic, being a pragmatic thinker, he understood that it is inevitable for a state which aspires to be a great power to ensure that it avoids war. It might become almost impossible for a state which aspires to grow to avoid wars and conflicts. In fact, Kautilya makes a very important observation. He says that a state which seeks power, essentially an aspirational state which wants to grow, which wants to emerge as a global power, it is at war all the time, whether you like it or not. Even if the state is not seeking hostilities, enmity, there will be external enemies, internal threats, which are constantly affecting the stability of the state. So according to Kautilyan philosophy, even though a king tries to avoid the war and focuses on welfare, the king should also understand that a state must be at war all times, fighting external and internal enemies through various methods so that the stability can be maintained. Now, this is very, very relevant advice even in today's times. War is a natural state for a kingdom, according to Kautilya. In fact, even modern thinkers like Max Weber, agree with this view. Max Weber popularly stated, there is no morality in international politics and international relations. Countries are guided by their self-interest, their national interests, which means countries are going to run into conflicts. One hostile state might use non-state actors to threaten its rivals, or 2 countries might get locked in a direct conflict because of a fight over natural resources or a fight over boundaries. So war is inevitable for states. This is something you need to understand. Even though the king or the state is focused on welfare, focused on maintaining stability, it is unavoidable that there will be external and internal enemies and a king has to deal with that. That is how stability can be maintained. If a king has to focus on welfare and development and progress, if the state is seeking power, if a state is looking to progress, if a state is aspiring to be a global power, there will be enemies creating trouble all the time, which means the state should be fighting a parallel war as we focus on development and stability. Now, this is great advice given by Kautilya, and it's not only relevant for the Mauryan Empire, it is also relevant in contemporary geopolitics. Now, let's see what were the purposes of Danda Neeti as identified by Kautilya, and let us apply this in contemporary geopolitics. Kautilya said, if the stability has to be maintained, we have to presume that the state is at war all the time, fighting external and internal enemies. So to maintain dharma, to maintain righteousness, to secure justice, to protect the state in the interest of national security, Kautilya advocated the employment of Danda Neeti, punishment, threats, coercion, force, etc. And there are 4 purposes behind it. When the state decides to employ Danda Neeti as a form of punishment or coercion, there are 4 purposes, 4 different purposes which are sought to be achieved. The first purpose is to acquire the unacquired. Certain states might be motivated to use Danda Neeti, to use force, threat and punishment or coercion to acquire something that they do not have. For example, in today's world, China is seen as an expansionist power. China is looking to expand its territory. Ever since the PRC was established in 1949, the communist state has been constantly trying to expand territory. This explains China's annexation of Tibet, Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia. It explains China's pursuit of more territory in South China Sea today. How China has picked multiple maritime disputes with Southeast Asian countries. It explains China's challenge to the Himalayan border with India, with Bhutan. So, countries try to acquire something that they don't have usually which could be territory. So they employ Danda. That's what China does with its aggressiveness, with its military posture, by issuing threats, by intimidating the other countries, and even by resorting to force if required. China is trying to expand its territory constantly. It's trying to acquire something that it doesn't have. This is one way of establishing state power and dealing with the enemies. Now, let's see this from India's perspective. How can we justify Kautilya's purpose of Danda Neeti? See, India is not an expansionist power. Unlike China, we have never sought territorial expansion. But one perfect example here would be India's pursuit of nuclear weapons in the interest of national security. To deter our immediate rivals, including China and Pakistan, the then Indian leaders and strategic establishment in 1950s and 60s, they realized that it was essential to acquire nuclear weapons so that we can create a deterrent, so that Danda Neeti can be employed. Essentially, you can intimidate, coerce the rivals, especially those who pose an immediate threat like China and Pakistan, given that we had already fought wars with both these rivals. Be it with Pakistan in 1947 and 1965, or with China in 1962. We had fought conflicts. China by then had become a nuclear weapon state by 1960s. So it became absolutely essential for India by 1960s to pursue nuclear weapons. So acquiring something that we didn't have, acquisition of the unacquired, is a clear example of Danda Neeti. This is the initial step to protect your national interests. Next, once you acquire something, you try to preserve that. Once you acquire the unacquired, you have to preserve that, which is the second purpose of Danda Neeti. For example, India is constantly trying to preserve its territorial integrity and sovereignty. See, we are not an expansionist power like China. We are happy with the territory that we have, but since we face constant threats from outside, which weakens our territorial integrity and sovereignty, we are constantly trying to fight off these threats by employing Danda, by using threats, punishment, even resorting to war if required. So this is an example of preserving the acquired. India has worked very hard to protect its nuclear arsenal. The Non-Proliferation Treaty was posing a threat. India boycotted the Non-Proliferation Treaty, calling it a discriminatory treaty. India employed coercive tactics to ward off the threat from the P5 against India's nuclear program, and even countered the American hostility in order to develop and test nuclear weapons. We preserved what we were acquiring, that is nuclear weapons. We preserved India's state as a nuclear weapon state. This is the second purpose of Danda Neeti. You employ punishment, coercion, threats, etc. to protect what you have acquired. This could be your territorial integrity and sovereignty from external enemies, from separatists, insurgents, or it could be preservation of your nuclear weapon status. The next purpose of Danda Neeti is to augment what you have preserved, to make things better. After you preserve your core priorities, you have to augment it, make it better. For example, now by using Danda Neeti, we have managed to protect our external borders from Pakistan, China, from separatists and insurgents as well, correct? But internally there are threats which weakens our stability, which weakens what we have acquired. We are dealing with multiple insurgencies, rebellions, separatist wars in northeast India, in Kashmir, in Punjab, and in the Naxal corridor, in the Red Corridor. So countering these rebellions, tackling the insurgencies, some of which are sponsored by external enemies, is also a core purpose of Danda Neeti. You employ the principles of Danda to augment what has been preserved. Even securing law and order, dealing with internal threats. It could be internal social divisions like communal divisions, or it could be crime, because they pose a threat to law and order and stability. So to augment what has been preserved, you need to employ Danda. You need to strictly enforce the laws to deal with crime, to deal with law and order situation, to prevent riots, to prevent divisions in the society. So this is also an aspect of Danda Neeti. And finally, the most important purpose of Danda Neeti, the fourth purpose, to ensure the fair distribution of what has been augmented, to work on prosperity, to ensure that you distribute the benefits equitably and ensure that you achieve economic security, which will guarantee military security and external security. Now this shows the pure genius of Kautilya. Look at how far-sighted this thought was. Kautilya understood that a state's external security, national security is inevitably linked with economic security and prosperity. Now once you secure your territorial integrity and sovereignty, once you have acquired the unacquired and defended from external threats and dealt with internal threats, you have to focus on distributing the benefits arising out of this. This is where a state has to focus on its internal economy, improve trade, create jobs, distribute the benefits so that you can arrest the resentment within the state. If you don't distribute the benefits of development, if you don't govern the areas properly, create opportunities for everyone equitably, then you will see resentment in certain sections and they might rebel against the state. Kautilya foresaw this threat. He understood if there is no development, no progress, then the state might lose everything it has gained, everything it has preserved, everything it has augmented. So for that purpose, you have to contain resentment. You have to achieve economic prosperity, and only when you have economic strength will you enjoy military strength and security strength. If you want to fight off your external enemies, deal with insurgents, rebels, you need to be a strong economy. This is very true in contemporary geopolitical world order as well. India can deal with so many different internal and external threats only because India has been able to exploit the economy, drive economic growth and prosperity, ensure there is inclusive, equitable growth to quell any rebellion, dissent, and counter any separatist tendencies. So this is great advice. Kautilya said this is one of the most important purposes of Danda Neeti. You need to ensure that you reap the benefits and distribute those benefits, create economic strength, which builds military strength and strengthens your national security. Now this is where I am reminded of a very interesting statement made by Thomas Hobbes, another leading contemporary thinker. Thomas Hobbes had said, power is strength and strength changes the minds. Which means that if you want to control the society, control your enemies, you need to employ power. Strength comes with power, and to derive power, you have to build not just your military strength, your security strength, but you have to build your economic and social strength as well. This is very, very true even today. To ensure that a country becomes a global power, the government needs to focus on social equity, social stability. It has to tackle internal, external enemies, build formidable armed forces and security forces, and at the same time, it has to ensure prosperity for everyone. Deal with all the threats, be it crime, be it law and order situation, or be it insurgency, separatism, or wars with other countries. Only then a state can be secure, and this is one of the core purposes of Danda Neeti. So to achieve these objectives, Kautilya laid down the aspects of coercive state power. He goes on to identify in great detail as to what constitutes the coercive strength of a state. How can a state enforce Danda? How can a state punish the enemies, maintain law and order, and protect security of the state? For this purpose, Kautilya identified the three primary elements of state security, which gives the coercive strength to the king: the army, the secret service, and the police. See, of course, back then, there was no concept of an air force, and Kautilya never spoke about naval power and maritime power because the Mauryan state, the Mauryan kingdom was never a maritime state. It was never a naval power. The focus of Kautilya was on the army. But of course, in today's context, you can equate this with your armed forces, which are meant to fight the external enemies of the state. which are meant to fight external wars, deal with external enemies, and even if required, deal with internal threats. It could be insurgencies, terrorism, etc. So Kautilya goes into great detail about how the armed forces have to be organized, how the armed forces have to be trained, what strategies and tactics should they employ to protect the interests of the state and to coerce the enemies, to punish the enemies and threaten the enemies. Kautilya pays a lot of importance. Kautilya pays a lot of importance on espionage, on secret service, covert intelligence operations to protect the state and its interests. This is a key element of coercive power of the state. So countries today rely on their intelligence agencies for early warnings, to track the threats, to monitor the threats, and even if required to carry out sabotage, targeted killings, and engage in such covert operations to protect the integrity of the state. This could even help in avoiding a full-fledged war. And states rely on police to maintain the internal stability, to deal with internal threats from insurgencies and rebellions to crime and law and order. You need a strong policing system. That is what Kautilya stressed upon under the Danda Neeti. Now, if you were to apply this to the Indian context, today we have formidable armed forces in the form of the Army, Navy, the Air Force. They are well equipped, highly trained, highly motivated, well organized, highly professional. They even have special forces like the para special forces, the Marcos, the Garud. So as a result, Indian armed forces, they are playing a critical role in enforcing the Danda Neeti of India, to punish the enemies of India, to deter the enemies of India, to protect the sovereignty, to fight external wars against external enemies, and even to deal with some internal threats ranging from insurgency to terrorism. India also has formidable intelligence agencies, IB, RAW, NTRO, and many others, which play a covert role in generating classified intelligence. They conduct clandestine operations to protect the interests of the state, to monitor the threats, and even to engage in sabotage, to weaken the enemy, to infiltrate the enemy, to break the enemy from within, and if necessary, even engage in operations, covert operations, which is aimed at carrying out targeted killings and assassinations, if necessary, to protect the interests of the state. In fact, in the next episode, we will talk more about covert war as advocated by Kautilya, because Kautilya was a very strong believer, as a pragmatic, as a realist. He was a very strong believer in covert operations, because he understood the effectiveness of a covert war, which can help avoid or prevent a full-fledged overt conflict. Since wars are very costly, expensive, it can derail a state. Kautilya stressed more upon covert war, and I would like to discuss more about this in the next episode. So if you want this discussion, do let me know in the comments so that we can continue this limited series and have a session on Kautilya's covert war and espionage and the role it plays in state security. Coming to your internal security, if you look at the Indian context, the CAPFs, Central Armed Police Forces of the Ministry of Home Affairs, including your border guarding forces like BSF, ITBP, SSB, Assam Rifles, they play a key role in border security, border management. They are not only protecting the territory and the integrity of the nation, they are ensuring that external threats don't infiltrate into India. They are tackling organized crime, infiltration of terrorists and insurgents, and even involved in counter-terrorist, counter-insurgency operations. If you look at your state police forces, they play a critical role in internal security as well, from tackling social problems to dealing with crime and law and order situations. They are playing a critical role in ensuring the stability of the state. So this represents the coercive arm of the state, the punishing arm of the state, which includes your armed forces, your intelligence agencies, and police forces. Now, if you look at what Kautilya said about armed forces in particular, there are some very interesting points and arguments he makes in the Arthashastra. Kautilya said that the Senapati, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, should be from the innermost circle of the king, who is loyal, who is committed to the king and the state. The Senapati should not only head the armed forces, but should be directly involved in military planning, in strategic thinking, and in conduct of military operations. Now, that is a similar structure that we have today. If you look at our armed forces, the service chiefs of the Army, Navy, Air Force, that is pretty much the role that they perform. Recently, India has introduced a major defense reform as far as the higher military leadership is concerned by creating the position of the CDS, the Chief of Defense Staff, who is a higher ranked military officer compared even to the Army Chief, Navy Chief, or the Air Force Chief. The CDS is the highest ranking military officer who serves as a single point advisor, military advisor to the defense minister and the government. The CDS plays a critical role in military modernization, in military planning, and even in the conduct of military operations. That's exactly what the service chiefs do. From modernizing their forces to keeping them motivated to executing the military plans, the strategies. That is the exact task of the commander-in-chief or the service chiefs. So you can see a comparison there. Then Kautilya spoke about the need for a state-run defense industry to produce the weapons that are required. Now, don't you see a comparison, a parallel here with defense indigenization? India has been striving to indigenize the defense industry. So, by and large, critical defense equipment, it's largely produced by state companies or public sector units like HAL, Bharat Electronics Limited, ordnance factories, etc. Of course, we did have import dependency. Even today, to an extent, we have import dependency. But definitely the government is focused on Make in India, to make India Atmanirbhar or self-reliant when it comes to defense technologies. So Kautilya had spoken about this in the Arthashastra. He highlighted the importance of a well-developed defense industry which is run by the king, which is under the kingdom, which is state-run, producing the essential military equipment of that era, of ancient era. So of course you can apply that in the modern context where state-run defense companies and even the private sector, as long as they are Indian companies, they can play a critical role in defense indigenization to make us self-reliant, to reduce our import dependency, which is very, very crucial in warfare. Then Kautilya spoke about the structure of the army, how army can be divided into the infantry, the chariot, cavalry, and the war elephant units. You see similar structures, organizational hierarchies present in the armed forces today. Look at the Indian Army, which is organized into infantry regiments, mechanized columns, and air defense units, artillery units, etc. So what I'm saying is that Indian Army has not drawn directly from Kautilyan thought, no. But we can understand the organization of our armed forces, our security agencies, by looking at Kautilyan thought, by using Kautilyan thought for analyzing the structure of our armed forces and security forces. In fact, Kautilya went a step ahead. He even suggested how a soldier should be recruited, how a soldier should be trained, what should be the motivation of a soldier. Kautilya advised the king to ensure that the king is directly involved in the science of warfare. Kautilya suggested that if the security of the state has to be protected through Danda Neeti, then the king should be personally involved in the science of warfare. Meaning the king should be involved in the planning, in the strategies and in the operations, which includes the recruitment of the soldiers, the training of the soldiers. Kautilya said that soldiers have to be strong, loyal, obedient to the king and the state. Of course, Kautilya was a believer in monarchy because that was the political model that existed. But if you take away that element, everything else that Kautilya spoke about, the armed forces and soldiers recruitment and training, applies in today's context as well. So loyalty to the king can be interpreted as loyalty to the state, to the country. He expected the soldiers to be committed to the king, and he expected the physical, mental capabilities of the soldier to be at the highest level possible, which included careful recruitment, intense training, high motivation, right incentives, so that they can endure the struggle, they can have the right skills to handle different weapons, employ different strategies and tactics in battle, and also they should have considerable battlefield experience. And today that is how the armed forces are organized and built. Look at the Indian Army, whose motto is service before self. Look at the Navy, the Air Force, how they recruit. Look at the Special Forces of India. Look at the tough recruitment process, the training and the motivation that goes into their preparation. So you can draw certain inspiration from here and better understand the armed forces of today. Kautilya said that soldiers should have no other interest apart from protecting the king and the kingdom. So today we can equate that with loyalty of the soldiers to the country, to the constitution, to the people. And also Kautilya said that soldiers should be capable of defending the country, defending the state against both internal and external threats. That is what India does. We do employ our armed forces not only to fight external enemies, but if necessary, to fight insurgencies, rebellions and separatists as well. And where armed forces are not suitable, we employ the police forces, the intelligence agencies, where a softer approach is needed. The police and central armed police forces take over the security role. So thus security forces play a role in both external and internal security, which is an aspect of Danda Neeti. It is a clear extension of the coercion arm of the state, where the laws are enforced, where the principles, the Dharma principles are implemented. Kautilya even spoke about the different types of armed forces, how different types of armed forces can be raised apart from the forces of the state. Now this is very, very interesting. I find this extremely relevant even today because you can draw parallels with contemporary times as well. Kautilya suggested that there should be clan-based armies, especially the army of the kingdom should mainly employ soldiers from particular clans who are hereditary soldiers such as the Kshatriyas, the war-fighting clan. Of course, today you can't see a direct parallel, but if you look at the structure of the Indian army, there is a certain equivalence that you notice. The Indian army, for example, is organized into different regiments based on certain identity. Of course, there is no discrimination within the army. Just because there is a Maratha regiment doesn't mean only soldiers from Maharashtra are recruited into that regiment. Just because there is a Madras regiment or a Gorkha regiment doesn't mean there is any discrimination within the army. In a democratic civilized state, of course, we have overcome those divisions, the clan or identity based distinctions. But you can see the underlying logic here. When you organize the armed forces based on clan or identity, it creates a better motivation, unifying factor for the soldiers. Kautilya's advice was, if all Kshatriyas who are hereditary soldiers are part of the clan army, part of the king's army, they will have a stronger unification factor. They have a stronger identity which allows them to work together, fight together. In Indian armed forces as well, we have different units today, which dates back to the British era of organizing the Indian armed forces, from Punjab to Madras regiment, to the Maratha light infantry, the Rajputana rifles, the Kumaon Naga regiments, Ladakh scouts. Like this, we have different region-based, identity-based units. As I said, there is no discrimination as such. It doesn't mean that only people from that community or region are recruited or they are deployed only in those regions. No, but using such classification within the armed forces serves as a strong identity element for the soldiers, which will unite them, bind them together, motivate them to fight better for the state, for the nation. Then Kautilya spoke about the need to depend on other types of armed forces other than the state's forces, which are mainly made up of Kshatriya fighters. Kautilya advised the king to rely on private corporations, private entities who can raise mercenary forces or hire soldiers for money and even raise private militias. Now, this is very, very true in the current context. Have you heard of the Wagner Group of Russia? A private mercenary force very closely linked with the Kremlin. The founder of Wagner Group, who was recently killed in a controversial manner in an airplane crash, was very close to Russian President Putin. Over the recent years, Russia employed this private mercenary force, a private company which had raised an armed force, a militia, and has been deployed in various conflict zones from Ukraine to Syria to African conflicts, where Russian interests are being pursued by a private mercenary force. Even United States has several private mercenaries which run as private companies that hire private soldiers raise militias to serve their purpose. For example, the United States, when it was fighting Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, it not only deployed private mercenary forces from private corporations, it even recruited local militias like the Kurds. It recruited the Kurds, which are also a clan-based community, a clan-based militia, to fight against a common enemy, the Islamic State. Then Kautilya spoke about coalition forces. Kautilya advised the king to work with the Mitra states to raise a coalition force of the friendly countries. And today the best example would be NATO, which is clearly a collective alliance that believes in the principle of collective defense. So India is not part of any such military clubs or alliances because we follow an independent foreign policy. But you do see this principle being applied in contemporary geopolitics. Kautilya even advised the king to raise a military force by recruiting refugees and POWs who might have a grievance against their home country. Now, India has done this. In 1971, when India protected the Bengali refugees from the genocide that Pakistani army was committing, we even recruited those Bengali refugees into a mercenary unit, a rebel force called the Mukti Bahini. India's RAW was authorized by then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi to train, arm and fund the Mukti Bahini rebels who would be infiltrated back into East Pakistan to fight against the Pakistani army and its atrocities. So that is a classic example of raising a fighting unit by using refugees and POWs. India did recruit Bengali refugees and turn them into the Mukti Bahini, which became a formidable resistance against the Pakistani army, which played a crucial role in enabling the Indian army as well when the war eventually broke out in December 1971. And Kautilya even spoke about recruiting tribal community and local people who are affected by a conflict and use them in the fight against the enemies. It could be internal enemy or external enemy. India has done this. For example, if you have heard of Salva Judum, a very controversial practice which was struck down by the Supreme Court later as unconstitutional, but the Chhattisgarh police employed this tactic. They recruited local tribes, the Koya tribes, gave them arms training and gave them a designation. They called them special police officers or Koya commandos and used this local tribal militia to fight the Naxals. As a strategy, it was great, but eventually such militias get misused. Salva Judum became controversial because of large-scale human rights violations, and eventually in 2011, in the Nandini Sundar case, Supreme Court struck down Salva Judum as unconstitutional. Of course, this practice of raising private militias doesn't sit with current constitutional order, but the strategy, the military strategy, the Danda Neeti is indeed very much applicable. In Jammu and Kashmir, we have the village defense committees which have been reactivated by the government to train the local people to defend themselves against terrorists infiltrating from Pakistan. We had used this strategy called village defense guards back in 1990s when Kashmir militancy was at its peak, where local people near the LOC were trained and armed by the state, by the security forces, so they could defend themselves against terrorists. Again, because of controversy and human rights violations, we had abandoned this practice as militancy went down. But recently, we have seen a surge in attacks against civilians, especially against minorities. So, the government of India has reactivated the Village Defense Committee initiative, where locals are being trained, even women are being trained, being supplied with arms so that they can defend their villages and they can protect the locals against any terrorist attack. So, these are the different armed forces and security forces that Kautilya spoke about. And even in today's world, you see such forces being employed by different states. Now, coming to my last point regarding Danda Neeti and Kautilya's thought on warfare. Kautilya advocated 4 types of warfare. This includes Mantra Yuddha, Prakash Yuddha, Kuta Yuddha, Sunim Yuddha. Kautilya said that war is inevitable. As a king, the state should be prepared. As we discussed earlier, the state is always at war, especially if the state is aspiring to grow. It will have internal enemies who are looking to bring down the state. It will have external enemies who are looking to contain the country or bring down the country. So, presuming that the state is always at war, Kautilya said, as much as possible, avoid war. The first approach is avoid the war itself. It doesn't mean you run away or hide, but you employ different tactics and strategies to avoid the war. One of them is mantra yuddha, where you use diplomacy and various tactics of upayas and shadgunyas that we studied in the previous episodes to ensure that you weaken the stronger adversary, especially when you are facing a stronger adversary. And if the king is in a weaker position, it is only logical to avoid the war at any cost, because if you try to instigate and escalate, the weaker state will naturally be defeated, because in any war superiority matters. Military superiority and even economic superiority, they matter a lot. So Kautilya had highlighted the importance of both economic and military might, and he advised the king to assess carefully whether your enemy is superior or weaker. If your enemy is superior, please avoid war and ensure that you employ mantra yuddha. Use diplomacy and various tactics, make the right decisions, employ sound decision making, and ensure you don't commit mistakes. Ensure you avoid the war, defer the war as much as possible, and try to weaken the enemy internally. Try to weaken the stronger, superior enemy through various economic methods, covert methods. This was the first suggestion for warfare. But eventually, wars are unavoidable. You may have to fight a physical war with your external and internal enemies. This is where Prakash Yuddha, Kuta Yuddha and Sunim Yuddha comes in. Prakash Yuddha is a form of overt war. Essentially, it's a reference by Kautilya to traditional conventional war, where the armies are openly fighting against each other in a regular warfare in the battlefield, where there are rules and conventions and conditions followed. There are rules of engagement. There are ethical constraints in place. So you can equate this with a conventional traditional war. A war, let's say, such as the India-Pakistan wars that we have fought. The overt wars of 47, 65, 71 and even the Kargil war. So this would be regular warfare, a physical, full-fledged confrontation between the armed forces where the rules of engagement is defined, certain constraints are in place, which includes your international humanitarian law. The other form of warfare is Kuta Yuddha, where you engage in irregular warfare. Asymmetric options are used. Hybrid warfare is employed. So you might prefer ambush tactics to carry out surprise attacks, which we refer to as insurgencies or guerrilla warfare. You employ various forms of non-conventional or asymmetric options, including sponsoring non-state actors, instigating internal rebellions, right? It's an example of state-sponsored terrorism. In the modern world, even cyber war, the digital warfare comes under the same bracket. The usage of drones, advanced critical emerging technologies, new age weapons. This represents a new form of warfare, a hybrid form of warfare, which is unconventional. And Kautilya spoke about such unconventional methods, hybrid methods, to disarm the enemy, to surprise the enemy while you're fighting a full-fledged overt war. Sometimes they all work in parallel, they work simultaneously. When you're engaging in mantra yuddha, kuta yuddha, you might be fighting an overt war as well. It's not that they happen separately or one after the other. Usually it might come simultaneously. When you're fighting an enemy, fighting a physical overt war, parallelly you might be engaged in using covert methods and other hybrid methods while engaging in diplomacy and while trying to weaken the stronger superior enemy. And finally, Kautilya highlighted the role of covert warfare. Now this will be the focus of my next episode, and if you wish to continue with this series, we would need your support and encouragement. So do let me know if you want another episode on Kautilya's strategy of covert warfare, what he referred to as Sunim Yuddha. He said that a state is well within its rights to engage in such illegal operations on foreign soil, which includes not only intelligence gathering through an effective spy network, but even carrying out acts of sabotage in enemy country, which includes targeted killings. So under Sunim Yuddha, Kautilya has given a lot of details about how a spy should function, what are the tactics a spy can employ, what strategies a king can use under covert war to weaken the adversary. These might be illegal or even immoral. It might even cross the boundaries of morality and ethics, but sometimes it might become necessary in order to limit the damage of Prakash Yuddha. because Prakash Yuddha is the most damaging amongst all types of warfare. To avoid the impact of a full-fledged war, you need to use covert tactics, hybrid tactics and mantra yuddha, diplomacy and sound decision making to ensure that you end the war as soon as possible. So Kautilya never supported a prolonged war. Please understand this. Kautilya said there are three types when you go to war: an open war, a concealed war, a silent war. An open war is the costliest option. The economic cost is high, it will weaken and drain your economy. It will lead to human losses, as thousands and lakhs of your soldiers and civilians could get killed. It could destabilize the country and society. So when you're fighting an open war, ensure you have superiority. Ensure you try to end the war as soon as possible by using other types of warfare, such as concealed warfare and silent warfare. Concealed war is nothing but kuta yuddha, sponsoring insurgencies, using ambush tactics, hybrid methods to confuse the enemy, to surprise the enemy and weaken the enemy, and employ covert options. Wage a silent war, a secret war to target the enemy, including sabotage and targeted killings and assassinations, or breed dissent within the enemy to create divisions within the enemy country. This is all part of covert warfare or sunim yuddha. Now, this is where the genius of Kautilya really shines through. When it comes to warfare, espionage and statecraft, Kautilya's advice is pure gold for any leader, and it is very, very relevant even in today's world, in today's geopolitics. Kautilya said, if the enemy has a superiority, avoid the war at any cost. Use mantra yuddha. Use the 4 upayas and shadgunyas to avoid that war. But if war becomes inevitable, when you are fighting a Prakash yuddha or overt war, minimize the cost. Try to end it as soon as possible and wage a overt war only when you are convinced that you have the superiority. If you don't have the superiority, try to weaken the enemy. Use an elaborate system of spies and espionage through sunim yuddha and target the enemy. Confuse the enemy, surprise the enemy with kuta yuddha, with a concealed war. This was the advice given by Kautilya, which the Mauryan Empire employed in its Danda Neeti. So as you can see, these examples are extremely relevant in today's geopolitics. You look at any ongoing conflict, the Israel-Iran conflict, Israel's conflict with Hamas and Hezbollah. So Israel is not only fighting a overt war with Hamas and Hezbollah, it is involved in covert war and a hybrid war with its enemies. Same goes for Iran. Iran is not only fighting Israel covertly but directly as well. Look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict. It clearly involves methods of overt warfare in the battlefield along with covert hybrid options and other asymmetric options. India has been engaged in similar wars, which is a mix of overt, covert and hybrid asymmetric warfare. So these are some valuable lessons that we can learn from Kautilyan thought. And if you like the session and if you want the PDF or the PPT of this session, join my Telegram channel. Scan the QR code. I'll give the link in the description box as well. So join my Telegram channel where I will be sharing the PPT of this session, through which you can make your notes and use them in answers based on questions in paper 2, paper 3 or in your optional paper. So I hope it's been another interesting, fruitful session. And if you benefited from this, please let me know in the comments. And if you want another session on covert warfare as discussed by Kautilya, do let me know in the comments and we will try to extend this limited series for a few more episodes. So do press the like button. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. That is it. I'll see you in the next episode, hopefully. Till then, take care. Have a good day.